Welcome back, soldiers. Tonight we walk the streets of Palermo, where one man was known as Il Barone, the Baron. His name was Salvatore Lo Piccolo. From the heroin routes of Sicily to the power struggles of Cosa Nostra, his reign marked the last shadow of the old Mafia order. Subscribe now, join the Mob Truth family, and let's uncover the rise and fall of Lo Piccolo, the Baron. Reign and power. By the late 1990s, Salvatore Lo Piccolo was no longer just another Palermo boss. He was becoming Il Barone, the Baron. His style was not to shout or to spread terror with bombings like the old Corleonesi. Instead, he worked through quiet deals, handshakes in the countryside, and a promise that business would continue as long as respect was paid. Every handshake carried weight. Behind it were construction contracts, drug shipments, and the silent taxes of pizzo collected from shopkeepers and businessmen across Palermo. Those who paid were protected. Those who refused quickly learned that Lo Piccolo's men could reach them anywhere. Unlike Rina, who left bodies in the streets, Lo Piccolo built his power through a softer touch. Alliances, negotiations, in the flow of heroin. A single meeting in an open field could decide the fate of neighborhoods, politicians, and entire drug routes across the island. To his loyalists, he was calm, calculating, and reliable. To his rivals, he was the silent hand of Provenzano's legacy, expanding influence while the old bosses fell one by one. This was the reign of Lo Piccolo, a baron who preferred whispers over gunshots. One of Lo Piccolo's greatest strengths was control of the heroin trade. The map of Sicily was not just geography, it was profit, power, and survival. From Palermo, routes stretched north toward Milan, west into Spain, and across the sea into North Africa. Every shipment moved under his watch. Sicilian ports, fishing boats, and hidden compartments in trucks carried a product that fueled Cosa Nostra's empire for decades. The profits were astronomical, and Lo Piccolo used them to tighten his grip on Palermo. Unlike the bloody chaos of the 1980s, Lo Piccolo ran the business with discipline. Meetings were secret, messages delivered by trusted men, and every kilo accounted for. Those who stole or spoke too much disappeared without a trace. The Baron kept the streets quiet, the money flowing, and the politicians at bay. For years, Palermo lived under a calm surface. But beneath it, Lo Piccolo's drug empire was as vast and dangerous as the waves crashing against Sicily's coast. But while Salvatore Lo Piccolo strengthened his empire in silence, the streets of Sicily were beginning to roar louder than ever. The scars of the past were still fresh. In the 1980s and early 90s, the Rina years had left Palermo drenched in blood. Judges like Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino were murdered. Police officers were slaughtered, and ordinary citizens had lived in fear every time a car bomb shook the city. That era had left a bitter taste, and the people of Sicily were no longer willing to live in silence. By the early 2000s, a new movement rose from the same streets where the Mafia had once walked with pride. Shopkeepers, teachers, students, and families began to say the unthinkable. Basta Cosa Nostra. Enough of the Mafia. They carried banners through Palermo's historic boulevards, walking past the same buildings that had once bowed to Mafia bosses, now filled with voices calling for freedom. One of the strongest groups to emerge was called Addio Pizzo, literally, goodbye to the Mafia tax. For decades, every business in Palermo had been expected to pay the pizzo, protection money to keep their shops safe. Refuse to pay, and you risked your life. But now hundreds of businesses stood together and declared they would no longer hand over a single euro. For the first time in living memory, entire communities united against the Mafia's iron grip. And while the people marched, the state tightened its hand as well. The Carabinieri deployed elite anti-Mafia units, determined to end Lo Piccolo's quiet reign. Behind banners, behind chants, behind the growing defiance of the streets, there was also intelligence gathering, surveillance, and informants slipping information to the police. Inside Cosa Nostra, Lo Piccolo faced another challenge. His influence was rising fast, but not everyone accepted him. The old guard, men like Antonio Rotolo, resented his growing control. Younger mafiosi whispered about his son, Sandro Lo Piccolo, who was being groomed to inherit Palermo's underworld. The cracks in the empire were beginning to show. For decades, Cosa Nostra had survived because the people stayed silent. Now the silence was broken. Palermo was no longer bowing, it was shouting. And for Salvatore Lo Piccolo, the Baron of Palermo, the walls were beginning to close in. The people shouted in the streets, and candles burned in memory of Judge Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino, two men whose assassinations had once shaken the very soul of Sicily. Their legacy had become a weapon stronger than fear itself. And as the voices of Palermo grew louder, the state responded. The Carabinieri, Italy's elite anti-mafia force, intensified their hunt for the Baron. Surveillance teams tracked movements in the countryside. Wiretaps captured whispered conversations. Informants, once too terrified to speak, began to leak secrets from within Lo Piccolo's circle. The net was tightening. For years, Lo Piccolo had lived as a ghost, hidden in farmhouses, slipping between safe houses, ruling without ever showing his face. But by 2007, even the Baron could no longer hide. It was a cold November morning when Palermo awoke to the sound of sirens. Streets were sealed, blue lights cut through the fog, and armored carabinieri units swarmed a villa outside Giardinello, just west of the city. Inside, Salvatore Lo Piccolo sat with his son Sandro and two trusted lieutenants. The raid was swift. Doors crashed open. Armed officers stormed the hideout. For the first time in decades, the Baron of Palermo was forced into the light, arrested without a single shot fired. In that moment, the silence that had defined his reign was broken. The same quiet strategy that had once kept him untouchable now ended with handcuffs in front of flashing cameras. Lo Piccolo, the man who ruled Palermo with whispers, was now paraded as the latest trophy in Italy's long war against the Mafia. The arrest of Salvatore Lo Piccolo was only the beginning. In Palermo's grand courtrooms, the Baron was brought before the state he had defied for more than 3 decades. Behind heavy red curtains and beneath the gaze of carved saints, prosecutors stacked mountains of files, years of investigations, testimonies, and intercepted calls. The charges were heavy: mafia association, drug trafficking, extortion, and murder. Each accusation carried the weight of Sicily's darkest years. And as the evidence piled up, Lo Piccolo sat in silence, the same silence that had defined his rule. He rarely spoke, never raised his voice, and even in handcuffs, he carried himself with the cold pride of a man who once ruled Palermo. The courtroom was more than just a place of law. It was symbolic. For decades, bosses had treated trials as a stage to show their defiance. But Lo Piccolo was different. He offered no fiery speeches, no outbursts. His silence spoke louder than words. It was the silence of a man who knew the code of omertà, the Mafia's law of silence. Around him, prosecutors dismantled his empire the piece by piece. Associates turned collaborators. Wiretaps revealed his orders. Financial records traced the flow of dirty money from shopkeepers' pockets to overseas accounts. To the Italian state, this was a victory. To the people of Palermo, it was proof that no boss, not even Il Barone, could escape justice forever. But in the underworld, his name still carried weight. The trial confirmed what many had long believed. Salvatore Lo Piccolo was not just another mafioso. He was the last echo of an era, a man caught between the old Corleonese blood rule and the modern mafia's silent business. From the grand courtroom, Lo Piccolo was led into a smaller, harsher reality. Cameras flashed as his mugshot was taken. A man once feared as the Baron of Palermo, now just another prisoner in the custody of the state. The photograph told its own story. The cold stare, the silver chain around his neck, the gray prison tracksuit. No longer the untouchable boss, no longer the hidden shadow of San Lorenzo. Only another number in the archives of Cosa Nostra arrests. But behind the camera lens, Lo Piccolo's silence remained. He gave no confessions, no statements, no regrets. Omertà, the Mafia's law of silence, still bound him, even as his world crumbled. Life inside prison was far removed from the villas and countryside safe houses where he once commanded loyalty. The days were spent inside a concrete cell, stripped of power, stripped of wealth, left only with time to think about the empire he had built and lost. For years, Palermo had feared his name. Now he sat in solitude, one of many old bosses who watched the world move on without them. Outside those walls, younger generations of criminals were already writing a new chapter, while Lo Piccolo faded into memory. The Baron of Palermo had fallen, not with a shootout, not with a bloody vendetta, but with handcuffs, silence, and the slow passage of prison years. For years, the heart of Salvatore Lo Piccolo's empire was not in the grand palaces of Palermo, but in places like this, hidden farmhouses scattered across the Sicilian countryside. To the outside eye, they looked abandoned, just crumbling walls and wild grass. But inside, these villas were the nerve centers of Cosa Nostra. It was here that fugitives were sheltered, money was counted, and orders were whispered. Lo Piccolo himself used hideouts like this to vanish from the authorities, keeping one step ahead of police for more than 2 decades. He lived as a ghost, never staying too long in one place, always relying on a tight circle of loyalists to move him from safe house to safe house. These walls saw meetings between men who shaped the drug trade across Europe. It was within rural hideouts like this that deals were made with South American cartels, and strategies were drawn for moving heroin along what became known as the pizza connection routes to the United States. But for all their secrecy, these villas were also cages. A man like Lo Piccolo could never truly walk free. Every knock at the door could mean betrayal. Every night could end in a raid. His power relied on silence, but silence also meant isolation. Over time, the safe houses that had once protected him began to feel more like tombs, where he ruled in the shadows, but as a prisoner of his own paranoia. While Lo Piccolo hid in silence on Sicilian soil, his power stretched far beyond the island. Under his leadership, Cosa Nostra remained a global player in the drug trade. Cargo ships like these, crossing the Mediterranean under cover of night, carried more than grain or textiles. Hidden in their holds were tons of heroin and cocaine, destined for ports across Europe. Lo Piccolo understood that the future of the Mafia wasn't in petty extortion, but in international traffic, a business worth billions. His network tied Sicilian clans to Colombian cartels and Neapolitan Camorra brokers, creating a supply chain that law enforcement struggled to break. Every shipment meant bribes paid to corrupt officials, alliances forged in secret, and a river of cash flowing back to Palermo. The streets of Sicily might have been quiet, but the docks of Barcelona, Rotterdam, and New York were alive with the profits of Lo Piccolo's empire. For ordinary Sicilians, this trade was invisible. But for Lo Piccolo and his allies, these ships represented something bigger than smuggling. They were the arteries of Cosa Nostra's survival in the modern world. Proof that even in hiding, he remained one of the most powerful bosses of his generation. The strength of Cosa Nostra was never just in guns or money. It was in the rules. Passed down from boss to boss, these codes bound men by blood and silence. No cowardice, respect for family, absolute loyalty, and above all, omertà, the sacred vow of silence. Salvatore Lo Piccolo rose through the ranks not because he was loud or ruthless, but because he lived by these rules. He knew when to show respect, when to strike, and when to vanish into the shadows. To his men, he was a figure of discipline, the kind of boss who punished betrayal with death, yet rewarded loyalty with protection and profit. But the rules were also a shield. They allowed Cosa Nostra to survive decades of war, betrayals, and state crackdowns. Lo Piccolo's empire was built on this foundation, reminding his soldiers that the Mafia was not chaos, but an order older than the Italian Republic itself. Still, even the strongest codes could not protect a man forever. The same laws that gave Lo Piccolo power would eventually be tested by the changing world outside, a world that was no longer afraid to defy the Mafia's silence. November 5, 2007. After more than 2 decades on the run, Salvatore Lo Piccolo, the man they called Il Barone, finally walked into a trap. At dawn, a convoy of black Mercedes and armored vehicles rolled quietly into the narrow streets of Giardinello, on the outskirts of Palermo. Leading the operation was Colonel Antonio Coppola of the Carabinieri's ROS unit, a man who had spent years piecing together the faintest traces of Lo Piccolo's movements. Alongside him stood Palermo's anti-mafia prosecutor, Francesco Messineo, determined to prove that even the most powerful boss was not untouchable. As the street filled with blue lights, heavily armed officers swarmed the safe house where Lo Piccolo was hiding with his son Sandro and two loyal lieutenants, Andrea Adamo and Gaspare Polizzi. The men had been living like ghosts, moving between abandoned farmhouses, relying on handwritten notes called pizzini to command their empire in silence. Neighbors watched from balconies as the silence of the alley broke into chaos. Officers in balaclavas stormed the building, dragging Lo Piccolo into the daylight in handcuffs. At 65 years old, the boss who once ruled Palermo without showing his face was now standing in the open, flanked by police with rifles pointed outward. In the car that took him away, investigators found not only money and weapons, but also Lo Piccolo's own copy of the Mafia rulebook, a chilling reminder of how seriously he enforced Cosa Nostra's codes. That morning, the reign of Salvatore Lo Piccolo ended not with gunfire, but with a quiet, decisive victory for the state. His arrest sent shockwaves across Sicily, a sign that even the most patient. After the police raid, the streets of Palermo fell silent. But silence didn't mean peace. These narrow alleys had seen blood spilled, deals whispered, and families destroyed. Every step here carried echoes of betrayal and revenge. For men like Salvatore Lo Piccolo, alleys like this were both sanctuary and battlefield, a place to disappear and a place where rivals disappeared forever. And above it all, Palermo stretched to the horizon, ancient domes, crumbling rooftops, and the sea beyond. From the sky, it looked eternal, almost beautiful. But beneath those rooftops, a war was always being fought. Politicians, police, and citizens wanted freedom. The Mafia wanted control. Palermo became the stage where history and crime collided, where every sunset promised another bloody dawn. And that, soldiers, was the rise and fall of Salvatore Lo Piccolo, Il Barone. Subscribe now, join the Mob Truth family, and welcome to all the new soldiers standing with us in the shadows. Until next time, the truth always walks these alleys.